From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to our first Film Music Live of the year. This is a show where you get to ask the questions for today's top composers, and I'm happy to have you here. It takes a bold composer to enter the wrestling ring with the legendary Von Erich family for filmmaker Sean Durkin's The Iron Claw. A movie as acclaimed as the patriarch's face-ripping power move. Leave it to Richard Reed Parry of the group Arcade Fire to play a tale of family triumph and tragedy with the rocking emotion the story deserves. Its music is steeped in the 70s country rock era that embodies the Texas wrestling family dynasty as much as the solemn chamber and orchestral power of their unfathomable loss and a mythic inheritance to live up to. Then there's Parry's submergence in the atmospheric world of sensual film noir for director William Oldroyd's EILEEN, the oppressed daughter of an alcoholic ex-cop who thinks she might have found a romantic way out of her dreary life when an alluring new psychologist joins the boys' reformatory she works at. But as always in the noir world of broken dreams, things will take a dark twist as Parry puts his own take on the genre's classic jazz sound, coming up with a haunting mystery score with empathy for an anti-heroine on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The Iron Claw and EILEEN are just two examples of how Richard Reed Parry is taking his Grammy-winning work into the scoring arena with a provocative, unique sound that marks him as one of the most interesting and instrumentally evocative musicians in the new wave of alt-rock raised composers, giving a faceplant to scoring conventionality. And now here's a composer who keeps going into the ring with some of film music's most unique power move scoring. Welcome, Richard Reed Parry.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, Richard. So I guess let's start by telling me about your musical development. Was composing something that you always saw yourself doing, or did you just kind of fall into it?
Yeah, I mean, not always, but from a pretty young age, I sort of started playing piano as a kid. I grew up in a folk music family, like a real proper kind of oral tradition folk music community where people sang songs at parties instead of listening to records on the stereo kind of thing. So I was really surrounded by music my whole life, and kind of because my parents were both like weirdo, amazing academics and folkies and artists, and my dad was a musician as well. I never really thought very hard about like jobs. I just thought about doing, kind of following my interest and following what I loved, as my parents had done, and just watching life kind of work out for them. So that was kind of my instinct, and I was always really obsessed with music. And at a certain point in high school, I remember coming home one day from school being super moved, having just seen Edward Scissorhands in the cinema, and that being the first time that something hit me that was a film score where I was like, oh my God. I came home, I was kind of like in tears. I was like, I want to be able to do this. How do I do something like this? So my mom was like, oh, okay, well, you can figure that out. You can figure out how to move towards that. And I didn't set about like trying to have a career as a composer per se. I just always followed my heart kind of musically, and went towards where music was happening, and did what I felt drawn to do. And so that meant playing in bands, learning different instruments, learning piano, learning drums, learning guitar, learning bass, a little bit here and a little bit there. And then kind of playing in one band and going to school for music, studying electroacoustic music, and doing all sorts of kind of scoring live films and scoring contemporary dance with different collaborative ensembles. And just putting one foot in front of the other, really. I didn't like go to school to study the one thing that I knew I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted to do music, and I wanted that to be a pretty open concept thing. but that film music bug was there from a young age. So I was really into soundtracks and really into various kind of early 90s ambient musics and things that felt really cinematic. And I went to a kind of an arts high school where people were doing all sorts of collaborative theater and music things and dance and music things. And so all the seeds were there when I look back at it. But really I kind of fell into it officially doing the film music thing through, I mean, I did a little bit of it in university, to be honest, but none of it was paid. And it was all kind of low key student things. But a good friend of mine who I play music with, named Kaveh Nabachian, made a film for the National Film Board of Canada while we were both in university. And he asked me to do some music for that with him and then some stuff alone. And I guess that was officially my first gig, was an NFB film. That was a really funny kind of documentary about a building. Yeah, and then kind of fell into it in a bigger way when Spike Jonze asked Arcade Fire to do the Her score while we were in the middle of making a record. And this is, obviously well into Arcade Fire's career. And it always seemed like something I'd come back to, like that I would do one day. But it was like, oh, I'm real busy. I seem to be real busy, like, being in a famous rock band, and that just roller coaster kept rolling and rolling and keeps on rolling. But the film scoring thing kind of landed at our feet. And then some year, I guess at 2015 or something, I put out this record called Music for Heart and Breath. That's kind of a modern classical minimalist chamber music kind of record. And Sean Durkin, who directed The Iron Claw, excuse me, and previously directed The Nest, just got in touch with me and said he'd really fallen in love with that record, and he'd written the whole screenplay of this new film he was working on, which was The Nest, at that time, while listening to my record. And when the time came, would I be open to doing the score for that? And I was like, yeah, totally. And so that was really my first in on my own as a composer with a capital C.
Yeah, I mean, Oscar nominations are going to be at 5 a.m. tomorrow. I'd love it if you got one for Iron Claw, but obviously Her got nominated for an Oscar. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, that was cool. That was so much more of that was like a band process, right? It was a lot more like just making a record with your band, except we were making a score, and it was kind of, lots of heads in the room all at the same time, and us jamming out, and Spike being there and trying things live in the room with us, and getting real involved and weighing in. And it was way more like being a band than being a composer, so where you're a multi-headed beast, and everyone's got ideas, and everyone's weighing in and arguing and this kind of thing. So very different process, but that obviously great, and was great and very surprising, and a wonderful honor to be nominated for the Oscar for that one. But again, when it's a shared task like that, it's a very different thing to setting out on your own and doing something.
And that kind of brings us to our first question from Aaron. How did writing and arranging for a film, how does it differ from writing for a band, which, people might say has a cinematic sound?
Right. Well, I mean, ironically, it's funny because as a band, you default to like, what are songs, right? What are our songs? And so you're riffing on things, and you're watching the movie. We'd have a projector set up and be watching clips of the movie in the background. And there was lots of kind of hunting and gathering, and people working on stuff individually at the beginning of that process, and everyone kind of throwing lots of different musical ideas at the table, showing up with kind of a, we showed up with kind of a grab bag of ideas already assembled. And, Spike having an idea of what he wanted, and, or thinking he had an idea of what he wanted, but it's like the directors never really know what they want until they actually hear it. And so, he says one thing and we try and do that thing, or our interpretation of whatever that thing is. And then, but then the first time that something actually, goes, aha, and sticks for him, that's obviously the first thing that we're going to do. And so that inevitably was playing something that sounded like a song, sounded like Arcade Fire playing a song, writing a song in the studio. So it ends up being that kind of a process. And we actually used some song ideas that we'd already been working on that were unfinished songs, or songs that didn't have full lyrics yet, things like that. So again, still much more of a band process. And when you're on your own, it's just like blank schedule, carte blanche, wide open sky. And specifically for this, actually for all the films I've done so far, for both of Sean's films, The Nest and The Iron Claw, and also for EILEEN, I was really lucky enough that both Sean Durkin and William Oldroyd, who directed EILEEN, just gave me carte blanche and really didn't give me much instruction at all, and just said, I want you to do your thing. And blessedly, neither of them really uses anything in the way of temp music. They just really wanted to leave it a true blank slate and see what I would fill in. And so that which I really appreciate that process, because working with temp music is a whole other thing. But for me, that's really a beautiful starting place, because the easiest part of composing for me is new ideas. I'm a constant wellspring of new musical ideas. Finishing things is another story, and getting them where I want them is another story. But in both of those cases, they were just like, just follow your nose, do your thing. And I could go back to my little studio cave, play instruments, make tons of musical ideas, record things, just start a million different directions, and then bombard them with those, and just go, here you go, here's a giant folder of music, like sift through and see if any of that resonates. After reading a script or watching a first cut or a handful of scenes or whatever. And then they're happy because they get to just like pick whatever appeals and start to work with that in some way. And then they kind of go, oh, I really like this piece and I like this piece, and there's something in this one, but it's the wrong speed for what I'd like to use it for. And so then you're like, okay, you start to have a back and forth feedback mechanism going. And that's been my process so far with films.
I'd love to talk about your first movie, The Nest, and it's now streaming on Netflix. And it's a crazy movie, because you think it's going to be, okay, where's Gary Busey hiding in this English manor? Because the camera kind of is, at one point the camera zooms in the wall. Okay, so where is the maniac hiding, and who's killing the horse? Who's doing all these horrible things? And it's not that movie at all.
Right.
What was that challenge like for Sean's first move, for Sean's second film and your first score?
Yeah, I mean, it was cool, because what he said to me was, this is a horror film. And it's like, it's actually not a horror film, but he's using the aesthetic of horror filmmaking as an aesthetic and a frame within which to look at what the story of The Nest is about, which is kind of capitalism and overconsumption and sort of betraying your own family, I guess, betraying simple human responsibilities in favor of chasing like a sort of an empty capitalist dream that's based on illusion, and kind of economic expansion and wealth, achieving wealth at the expense of kind of anything, at the expense of sanity, or the expense of family and love and familial responsibility. And anyway, and so using a horror film aesthetic for that is what he was actually aiming at doing, and that's what the film is. But what he said to me was horror film. So I kind of went into it with my compass set a certain way, and then realized, oh, this all has to sort of feel like it's on the verge of turning into a horror film, and nothing actually ever. Well, some horrifying things do happen, but on a very human scale, not on a thriller. There's no blood and gore except for the horse dying, which is kind of terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, and the one thing that really struck me, and that kind of leads into our next question, is that it really has a kind of a sad jazz score, and it kind of takes us into EILEEN, which brings us to Louis' question. I really enjoyed your score to EILEEN. Where did you draw your inspiration from for the score? Was it from film noir movies or somewhere else?
Honestly, the only reference point that we used for that, well, when we started, once again, Will Oldroyd really gave me carte blanche, but he asked me if I would use soprano sax and oboe. And I said, sure, great. That's it's a really like specific request, and yet it's still totally wide open. And you can do anything with that. And I knew the era of the film, and I'd read the book. I'd read Otessa's wonderful book. And so I knew the flavor of it, which it's like, it's this sort of dark, wintry, New England-y kind of depressive atmosphere. But again, that was kind of all I knew. That was the guideline that I had, was just these two instruments, and here's the film. And at a certain point, I started just making ideas and playing things. I wrote a lot on the pump organ, and then wrote a lot on the upright bass. And at a certain point, Will was like, I just watched Taxi Driver again, and I hadn't seen that in ages. And that's a really good reference point, like the kind of this feeling of like bottled rage. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was it in terms of reference points, like for that film. That was the only thing in terms of temp music or guidelines that he gave me. And I loved Taxi Driver, and I love that score so much. That Bernard Herrmann score is that's just like one of the all-time achievements, really, that film, and the score. And honestly, like, I couldn't point to a lot of specific other points of specific inspiration that I was drawing on, besides that I've kind of gotten into a lot of jazz sort of later in life, and like in the last 10 years, where I really didn't have much of an ear for it as a 20-year-old or as a teenager. And just just the story, I guess, is where the inspiration came from, to be honest. And then you just connect to it. You connect to the feeling of the story. And then for me, I just kind of try to follow my intuition in terms of where does that lead me in terms of musical territory that I'd like to explore? Like, what's the musical place that I'd like to inhabit? And you just start to play things, and you write things, and you go, oh, I like that one, and I like that one. And then the director says, oh, I like that one and that one. So you have a few reference points between the two of you of things that might work, and you just get into it. And I kind of gave myself the guideline of, I want, this is set in the 60s, and I want this to sound like it could have been made in the 60s, yet without aping a bunch of really specific 60s music. But I'd like it to be able to sit next to something from that time in some way, or in many ways, be that sonically, or in terms of the arrangement, or the kind of melodic or tonal writing that you're doing. But again, also trying to always do my own unique thing, and just, follow something in whatever direction that it wants to be followed. So not trying to hem myself in too much to like, oh, this has to sound like the 60s, but just knowing somewhere in the back of my brain, this would be cool to have it be able to sit next to other instrumental musics of the 60s.
It definitely does. But again, it's kind of like a cousin of the Neston way, because there's something really warped about the jazz. Because again, you don't know if EILEEN, the character, is going to end up killing somebody, or because she seems, much like her character in One Night at Soho, and I just love this actress, that she's just on the verge of doing something really pretty bad.
And there's all these cool, there's such complexity there in the characters, and it's like, that's the fun part for me, is the complexity of the story and all the different emotional angles of the story that are there, being these these mile markers, or these doors that you can open, where you're like, oh, I've got this door. Like, there's really sad aspects to this story. The overall thing isn't, you wouldn't say, oh, it's a sad story about X, Y, and Z, but there's really sad things buried in there. But then there's also really funny things buried in there. And there's kind of, raw, edgy, depressive things buried there. And there's really deeply humane things buried there. And there's like all sorts of kindness on display. And then there's this noir. It's like, oh, and there's also romance on display. We think, sorry for spoilers, spoiler alert. But if you're watching this, then if you haven't seen the film, it's too bad. But it's like, we think there's this real romance happening between Anne Hathaway and Thomason's character in the film, EILEEN. And so for a while, I'm trying to take the score in this way of, it's like, oh, there's this allure to this new woman who arrives on the scene, and we're all expecting that there's going to be this hot romance between this older woman and this younger woman, both working at this youth prison, which is already, it's like, whoa, this is a dark, like, kind of punishing setup for for this young woman to be living and working in this youth prison. And anyway, it's so fraught with so many different cool emotional angles. And that's all of those things are like, those are worlds that you can delve into musically, where you're like, oh, let's get romantic about this, but let's have that romance have an edge of darkness and unpredictability. And let's have the depressive aspects of life have, shallow depressive aspects, and then really depressive aspects where it really gets kind of dark and squelchy. And then let's also have it be funny, because there's also a humor to her life. And let's also have something very mysterious lurking in the background, because there's also weird, inexplicable things going on that are below the surface that we don't find out until later in the film. So, all of those things are just like these pathways that are, for me, they're just like, they're kind of calling my name musically from the get-go. And you just get to pick which ones you explore, and hopefully you get to explore all of them. And in the case of that movie, I really tried to go down all the pathways and wind them all up into a bit of a snarled tangle.
Now, in terms of snarling and tangling, this brings us to our third question from Ivan. Which component of Iron Claw affected you or attracted you as a composer? Was it the opportunity to do music about real life people, or that you liked wrestling and wanted to do a sports score?
Both. When I started that one, once again, when I started that one, Sean was very minimal with the instructions about what he wanted, which is really his way of working. He likes to leave you to your own devices to see what you discover, and to see which direction my instincts would take me in the context of his film, as opposed to what he wanted. So I started with the instruction of big drums. Which was all he said. He was like, I'm thinking big drums. And I'd read the script. I knew, okay, this is this big wrestling drama, but he didn't say anything in terms of what role he wants the music to play. And so, it being a film about wrestlers, I'm thinking, okay, big drums, we're scoring action, and we're scoring wrestling, and we're scoring the matches, and we're scoring life in the arena, even though there's many dimensions to the film. And so I started making all this high energy, high impact, and once again of an era, kind of 70s rock music. And the only reference points I had musically for that one were that Sean had been listening to all this 70s rock while he was writing the script. So there was these Rush songs and Springsteen and George Harrison and Blue Oyster Cult, all these kinds of things. And so I was making all this kind of high energy, exciting, kind of big, like duty rock energy kind of stuff, and bombarding him with that, and kind of synthesizers and playing drums and guitars a lot. And then once more of, and I also wrote, because I wrote the song that's in that film that the young brother Mike sings, like he's in a band, and he's, his band plays at this house party, and they're rehearsing that song, and they're playing it at the house party. And then that's, later on when things go very downhill, he's also kind of singing it as he's having a dark night of the soul. He's kind of strumming it while his brain is, while he's having, mental injury, physical health problems, and kind of suicidal ideations, and struggling, and still hanging on to this song that's used as a real emotional through line of sorts. And then it's also the credits song, and I co-wrote that with my partner, my wife, Laurel Sprengelmeyer, Little Scream. And so we had written that early-ish on in the process. I'd thought maybe there's a song that needs to be in this film, because all of the music that Sean had been showing me was songs. And I thought maybe one of these characters wants to have a song kind of going in their head as like an interior monologue kind of thing, or who knows exactly, but seemed like there was an opportunity to make kind of rock song energy for the arena, and then also have this kind of rock song of the young, the young men wrestlers, aspirational kind of music, and have those things connect. And then as we actually got into it and they got into editing the film, it was like, no, this high energy stuff is mostly not sticking. It's only sticking to stuff that's happening in the ring. But in fact, a bunch of the stuff in the ring needs to be a little darker and a little more somber and a little more, about something bigger and more nebulous and harder to get your hand on, harder to get your thumb on, emotionally, rather than just like big rock energy. And so started to take a wider view of the thing, and Sean was like, yeah, I think we need some stuff that's more claustrophobic, and he was really obsessed with this idea of the family curse, and that we needed a theme for the curse that all the brothers think is chasing them, and bringing them all this sorrow and ruination. And so I kind of abandoned the rock music for a while, put that on pause, started chasing more murky, dark, brooding themes. And it wasn't that we'd like thrown away all this rock music, but it was like we'd gotten a bit of it and established that as one touch point, and left it while we then explored this darker, murkier, more somber territory. And then after a while, he was like, no, we need to just get sad. We need to play the sadness. We need to play the interior depth of sadness that these guys are feeling, because actually that's what people are connecting to in this film. And these things, you can't know all these things in advance. It's not Star Wars. It's not like we have the Empire theme, and we have the Rebels theme, and we have the Tatooine theme, and we have the Galaxy theme. It's like you're really discovering what works about the film emotionally as you get into it, editing wise, as a director. And so that feedback was coming back at me all like during the process, like, oh, actually we have to pivot. None of this is sad enough. We need to get sadder and smaller. And, so you go from kind of grand and big drums and aggressive and male energy to like brooding and creeping and curse-like and claustrophobic, to delicate and sad and very, very small and minimal. And then in the end, the movie is actually kind of all of those things. You keep certain pillars of each of those batches of music, and you figure out that you actually have these very distinct musical touch points that you're ping-ponging between, and that is actually the heart of the film. It is all of those things, but going into it, we did not know that in as many words. So
wow. Well, I want to give a big shout out to 824 Music. They're providing 5 digital downloads for our questions, so send in your questions. I don't, wrestling, like that kind of wrestling, has never been the stuff of serious movies before. I'm usually thinking of the one and only with Henry Winkler, and this movie really is, to my knowledge, the first score anthem to treat this like The Godfather, like this incredibly very epic, like this is real, this is a real sport. What was the challenge of that? Because when you have these kind of goofy, for the lack of a better word, you got Ric Flair and all these guys, what's the trick to making you take this seriously musically?
Yeah, I mean, that was really the challenge. And that was, one of the ways in which the goalposts were moving as we went along. It's like, especially as we did this high energy stuff, kind of high impact in the ring kind of music. And there is that, there's like the Rush, Tom Sawyer music was the walk-on music for the brothers, and that was definitely going to be in the film from the beginning. So we knew, okay, that's gonna be this huge anchor point. We need all this music that'll sit alongside that. And trying to keep up with Tom Sawyer by Rush is also, that's a no mean feat. It's a high bar to hit. But yeah, no, it became really clear as we went along that the things that were sticking to picture, because you just throw ideas at the picture and you see what resonates and what sticks, and sometimes why it's resonating and why it's sticking is kind of mysterious. And so originally I actually tried, like the opening sequence of the Iron Claw was one of the first scenes that came, that was like, this is done. This is our opening. Like, that's going to be the film. And so I was like, okay, I want to try and nail that one musically, so that's the door through which everything else, the door opens and then everything else passes through that. And so originally I had like an instrumental version of the song that is ultimately the credits song that's in the film that they play live, that Mike plays live in the film. I had that, a kind of slow motion, sad but kind of triumphant version of that as a proposed music for the opening. And Sean was just like, it's too soon, it's too hopeful, it's too big, it's too good, like good-hearted, it's too mighty. We need to be planting the seeds of everything that's to come, right? It's not actually this glorious triumphant moment of the dad wrestling in the ring in the 50s, early 60s. And it's like, right, yeah, there's way more to this film than that. So having it feel too triumphant just didn't quite stick. And then we looked at other beginnings of some other sports movies, like we looked at the beginning of Raging Bull. It was like, okay, what works about this? This is just such a classic. And the opening of the Iron Claw is of a different era, right? It's in black and white, and it's like, this is happening the generation before. This is like when the boys are just little kids and the dad is still the wrestler. And so it's like, okay, let's bring the opening music back to being of a different era and feel more like it's brooding and it's gnarly and this is the birth of the family curse, the Von Erich curse. And let's see what that might feel like musically. And so found that, and then found what eventually turned into the Ric Flair music, and finding this kind of big drums and big kind of tremolo strings and brass. And I knew from the get-go, like, I want to use brass as like the in the arena music and kind of tie that to the ring. And it ended up being like, no, we're tying that to the whole film. And it does kind of connect you to the arena and the big cavernous feeling of life in the ring. And it also connects you to this kind of, quasi classical world of music and older film scores. And it also connects you, to like the different polar extremes of what French horns specifically, but brass traditionally, that's used to like announce the arrival of kings, right? And herald in these big grand moments. But it's also like French horn is like just about the most mournful, lonesome, guy alone on a mountaintop kind of instrument that you could use. And so French horn up close and really, really dominates the score of the French horn. And that's Pietro, who's my studio mate and musical partner, and he recorded and produced the whole thing, and plays all the French horn on the whole thing. And that was really like, oh yeah, this is essential. This kind of instrument that's mighty and regal, and is also totally sad and forlorn and mournful and alone. And that's the heart of this thing, right? It's all these dudes who are just like, I'm king of the ring, I'm king of the world, and they're in the height of their prime, and they're also just like dying from loneliness and sadness and this kind of bleak emotional landscape that they're growing up under this tyrannical kind of king figure, So I think that was the emotional thread conceptually tying the kind of instrumentation choices for this score.
Now, on that note, Dale thought that the funeral time music was beautiful with the small strings and the piano piece, which plays over David's funeral. How did you want to approach that specific scene?
Well, interestingly, that was the last one. Second last one, but that was a tough one. And we actually ended up using that same funeral music at the end when the other brother, Carrie, dies. Spoiler alert, sorry. But if you don't already know the story, well, too bad. That was where that specific scene was, where Sean was like, the music that we had made up until that point wasn't going to stick anymore. Where originally, or, kind of phase 2 was like, the whole thing needs to feel creeping and cursed and claustrophobic, and like something is coming for these guys and that they can't get rid of. And it's kind of snaky and following them. And then at a certain point it was like, yeah, that's just not working. Maybe we just need to do something super sad and like solo piano and strings. And I was like, oh no, not solo piano. It's such a trope, but obviously it's so much beautiful music written with that most basic format. And so much beautiful music remains to be written using that same format. So I was like, okay, let's get into this and just, do some really simple, small, deathly intimate kind of music where it was like playing playing to the action or this invisible implied action of the curse, you know, this thing following these guys, or playing to the actual action of the sequence isn't working. Let's try and play to that very tender, very reticent, very hard to reach, small, emotional, sad voice inside of these guys, or inside of anyone in the family, that is essentially like reaching for, you know, a repressed emotional voice that needs to speak its piece, right? And that funeral before they go, you know, you have the dad saying, they're all the boys are wearing sunglasses, and the dad's like, take off those glasses, like there's going to be no crying, I don't want to see any tears at this wedding, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to hear, you know, it's like, I don't want displays of emotion, I don't want emotion to be what we are talking about here. You're all going to like put on a happy face, and we're going to do this, and it's going to be respectful, and that's that, you know, there's just this like tough titties Texan, you know, harsh dad, you know. And so trying to reach for that sort of feeling of like a small, unheard, you know, not going like romantic and widescreen cinematic piano and strings, but going really small and delicate for that kind of unheard voice inside of, you know, these big hulking dudes, right? You have all these like muscly dudes, and inside of everyone is this little emotional self that feels sad when someone in your family dies. And so there came a point in the process where it was like, we have to keep reaching for that. We can't reach for the action more. We have to just reach for the tiny heart of things.
Now, Majesta would love to know, how do you approach creating a musical score for a film in general? I mean, are there specific steps that you follow, or does it vary from project to project?
It's been kind of the same for me thus far on all the films I've done. I'm really someone who music sometimes pops into my head when I'm just walking down the street, but it mostly occurs when I play music. So if I sit down at the piano, if I sit down with my double bass, if I sit down with the guitar, if I sit down with the drums, anything, if I sit down and play, music comes out. And that's just how it works for me. So if I play, something comes out, and that something usually resembles a song, or the beginning of a song, or a compositional idea that for me, I feel it pointing to something. So that's where I almost always start. And then whatever guidelines I might have, in this case, like writing stuff for film, you know that it has to fit into the landscape of, you know, the emotions of the film, whatever those may be. Or if it's an orchestral commission or something like that, that's more of a music for music's sake kind of thing, then I know, oh, okay, this is a cool idea. Does this work for a string quartet, if that's what I'm writing? And then I kind of proceed from there. And from there, I get ideas in my head as I'm walking, but I rarely get like a standalone idea just pop into my head out of nowhere. It usually has to come from playing, hearing something, thinking, oh, that's really compelling, you know, finding a musical idea just by exploring on an instrument. And then from there, stuff starts to snowball and pick up other little ideas. Oh, here's a counter melody that would attach to that nice thing that I was already singing or playing. And so in terms of working that into film process, that's where I start. I usually just play instruments a lot. I play a lot of music, and I record everything I do. As soon as there's something resembling an idea, I flag it, and then maybe I'll record it again, or record a few variations of that, and then I'll move on. And I'll just do that for a while. I tend to not work to picture at the beginning at all. I'll watch the film or whatever exists of the film maybe once, and then just kind of try and work in the dark, and listen. Listen to whatever direction the musical ideas that I have want to go, and just have faith that some of what I'm doing will connect something. If it's only one thing, or if it's 10 things, it'll connect to some aspect of the film, and that'll be our first starting point, and we'll go from there. And so I tend to make, as many fresh ideas as I can in the very early stages, and then I just throw them all at the director and see if any of this resonates. And if I've got any particular leadings, I'll say, I think there's something strong in this one that connects with whatever I've seen or whatever I know of the film so far. And yeah, really just go from there. See what a director likes, what they respond to, even if they don't know. If they're like, oh, I like this one, but I don't know what it would be for, but keep exploring it because it seems like a thing, then I'll just do that. And eventually something ends up sticking to picture and you go, oh, okay, that works. Great. And then you have a starting point and you go, okay, well, if that works there's another scene that kind of mirrors that scene earlier in the film or later in the film. So let's try a parallel piece or another version of the same piece for that same scene and see if we can connect things that way. And eventually you're just throwing darts, and you have enough darts. Eventually you hit enough good numbers that you start to have a little bit of a connect the dots picture of what the film, the musical landscape of the film could be. And I'm lucky to have just kind of pretty strong musical intuition, and tend to just follow my nose and have faith that that's going to work out one way or the other, even if I don't always know exactly what I'm doing or why. I have to just follow whatever that impulse is, and see it through, and know that even if it doesn't work out in this moment, that I'm not necessarily making, the perfect idea for they'll make the perfect score for this scene. It'll still be really good for something, and that something might be down the line. That might be the next film, so I have this like massive many folders of like rejected ideas, but that I know are perfectly good musical ideas. They just weren't for that project, and they might not even be for a film. This might be like, oh no, these are Arcade Fire ideas, or these are Bellercast ideas, or these are for if I'm writing another string quartet, this would be great to write for string quartet, anything like that. Anyway, all the ideas go on the great compost pile and turn into something eventually.
You could say it's a defiantly kind of this movie is not Rocky. It's certainly not my one and only, but for me, like the sports movie scoring really comes into play at the ending. And forgive me if I'm mistaken, that where you bring an orchestra into the score for the first time. And that's okay. We're in sports movie land.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, we kind of go in and out, don't we? We kind of start orchestral, actually. Like that opening scene is kind of, it's like the opening title is, it's kind of a bunch of strings, bunch of dark strings, and a bunch of brass, like whole built up brass section, and big orchestral cymbals and bass drums and things like that. And then we kind of downshift into like life with the brothers, and it is kind of rock music. And then you're kind of in this weird in between kind of chamber music, rock music hybrid kind of stuff. And then it really pushes and pulls, like the same way that the movie does. You're going in and out of this stuff in the ring that's this big rock energy, and then stuff that's getting into these creepy corners of the relationship, the relationships in the film, and the kind of interior emotional worlds of the guys. And it's a lot of like zooming in and zooming out, and shifting between emotional landscape of film, interior emotional landscape of characters, exterior action landscape of film, and then kind of emotional overview of characters. I think the score really takes different roles in this film, and it does that kind of, I think it does it simultaneously some of the time, but it's, I wouldn't call it like channel flipping, but it's definitely like, it's kind of the role that it plays kind of changes throughout the film, in different ways.
What do you think about the reaction to Iron Claw? I mean, I certainly didn't expect to have like a big lump in my throat at the end of this movie, and it really, the movie literally seems to have a literal impact on people. And what part of the score do you think is responsible for that?
I mean, it's a really interesting movie in many ways, but I think, now that it's like the word is out and people know they're going to see a sad tearjerker movie, but especially at the beginning, before anyone had seen it, it was like, I think it was kind of mysterious to people, where it's like they didn't really know what they were going to see. And it's like, it's kind of a cake with a knife in it. In a lot of ways, where it's like, you're like, whoa, Zac Efron is like pumped up, and Jeremy Allen White is pumped up, and these dudes just like, it's like so physical. And the first trailers for the movie are all like with Tom Sawyer, and it's like glory days, and it is more like Rocky or something, that kind of energy, like big Hulk sports dudes rock energy. And I think there's you got to get people in the seats also, and you can't necessarily like, I think it's a confusing movie in certain ways, where like it appeals to your senses in one way, and it's family, and it's youth, and it's power, and like all this raw physicality, and fun, and brotherly love, and young romance, and Texas Forever vibes, and this kind of thing. But then it's like, actually, the whole thing is a Greek tragedy of sorts, right? It's just like things go wrong, and then things go more wrong, and then they continue to go wrong, and what you're left with is like something that's very real, but that most movies are afraid to do, which is like get to the heart of the tragedy that is at the center of life for all of us, where it's like, we are all headed in the same direction, and everyone we know is headed in the same direction. And this is, you're seeing this in a brutal, lives cut brutally short, and young lives cut off abruptly kind of way. But it is, there's something that's so universal about it that I think like a lot of movies are afraid to do, because that's a hard thing to watch on screen, like face the only thing that's guaranteed to all of us and everybody we know and everybody we love, and I think that's rare for a movie to really go there, and it doesn't really tell you that it's going to do that, and the format then, through the cartoonish wild lens of just such a strange theatrical, mysterious element of culture. Yeah, so I think all of that kind of adds up to when the end of the film comes, and you're like, damn, like I've just followed this lovely, loving, if complicated as anyone's family is family, through like the great steps downwards towards like most everyone's death. It's like, I think that just hits all of us on the most guttural level that it possibly could, and so score wise, really, I was just trying to reach for things that felt like they could emotionally tie to what was happening on screen, and also just hold some space for those emotions that are there in the story and in the film. Just hold some space for feeling lonely, for feeling sad, for feeling glorious, for feeling hopeful, like all of those things, for feeling love, and just kind of hold space and punctuate the film as much as it allows itself to be punctuated by music, in a way that can just hold space for everyone to have those feelings and just sit with those feelings, and then we wrap it up with, the Kevin and his son, Kevin saying, his son's asking him, why are you sad? And him saying, well, I used to be a brother. It's funny. Yeah. I get emotional just talking about it every time. It's like it's such a strong end to the story, where it's like, I used to be a brother and I'm not a brother anymore. And saying that to his own sons, and then his son saying, it's okay, Dad, we'll be your brothers. And then you have this kind of great swell of emotion. And then we hit the rock song that's like written by the younger brother who's not with them anymore. And it's like I'm crying thinking about it, it's like, it's just like it's a powerful package of humanity, I think. And it's like a really bold film in so many ways. And it really like sticks to its guns of like holding space for the tragedy of human existence that we're all in,
Well, it's such an amazing film and an incredibly powerful score. And I'll just kind of wrap this up by my last question. I think Louis brought it up to me. If you were a wrestler, what is your wrestler name? What is your power move?
Wow. Never been asked that before. Man, if you had asked my 12-year-old self, I'm sure he would have an answer for you. What is my name and what is my power move? Maybe I'm wow. Maybe I'm what an amazing question. The mind spins with possibilities. Maybe wow. Well, really caught me off guard. Not expecting that one. Give me a sec. Give me a sec. I'll get it. I'll get something. Maybe I'm like maybe it's something to do with flames. Maybe it's like like Richie Flame Boy. No, that's no good. That's no good.
Well, I'll let you get to it. Richard,
Something involving fire. Something involving fire. I'd have like a flaming something that would like, you know, I could have like a whatever flaming
guitar like Fury Road dude.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Sorry, wow, that really caught me off guard. Hard one to answer.
You got it. Well, Richard, I just want to thank you so much for joining us at Film Music Live. The Iron Claw and EILEEN are now in theaters with Richard Reed's Parry scores, available on A24 Music and Milan Records. And I want to give a special thanks to Kyrie Hood at Whitebeard PR, Gabby Edzi and Shipper Gutra at A24 Music. And our show's executive producer, Mark Northam, graphic designer, Mark Banning, and our show producer, Dale Turner. And I will be seeing you on the next Film Music Live on Monday, January 29th at 1:30 as Michael Giacchino joins us to talk about being a musical member of the Society of Snow. Thank you so much for joining us, Richard. It's great having you here.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.